Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
I think I'm all right. Good afternoon. I spoke a few weeks ago down at St. Peter's Church, and I used to, years ago, when I would speak, I would always, particularly if I was speaking before a group of the fairer sex, I would always start out by saying, "Good afternoon, girls," and I'd always get a little chuckle and so forth, and people were quite thrilled. But of course now that's illegal. But when I spoke down at St. Peter's Church here a short while ago, the lady who brought me there said it was for the Girls Friendly Society. And so I said, here's my chance. I can go back and say, "Good evening, girls." The speaker, the president, got up and introduced me, and they were happy to have me speak before the Friendly Guild. They had dropped the Girls Friendly, so, I have to stop using the word girls. Always a great pleasure for me to talk about Morristown. Usually I talk about food, as most of you know. How many have heard me before? So I've got to change I've got to change a lot of my stories around then. I usually like to find out a little bit about the audience, whether some of you, I'm sure that some of you people know a little bit more about Morristown than I do. But anyway, I always like to find out how many people have heard me before, so I don't have to tell the same story twice, because it may not be just the same, you see. So I have to be careful. I thought today I'm going to go away from food. I do want to beg you to interrupt me and ask me any questions you'd like to, because it's my pleasure to talk to you what you want me to say. But rather than talk about food and tell you about WF Days and Days ice cream and mocha cakes and all the other standard things that I usually talk about, I thought you might like to take a walk with me this afternoon and walk around the park as I remember it. How many of you have been in Morristown, I don't dare use any numbers, do I? A long time. You know, that's right. You see, I had to be very, very careful what I say this afternoon. But there are a few of you that don't know about Morristown. And Morristown was the place around the turn of the century when the wealthy people from New York came out here to build their beautiful estates. How my grandfather was smart enough to come out and start the catering business in 1862 and be Johnny on the spot to do all the entertaining was a remarkable thing. But let me just change my format a little bit, and let's take a walk. If we walked out this back door over here and looked across here, why, we'd run into the back door of Dr. Mills Hospital. And the people who don't know about that part of Morristown, many very serious and critical operations were performed in this private home that was right here and back. Some of you might have walked out and noticed that the road along your property here is rather narrow. Do you know why it's so narrow? Well, there was an Irishman in Morristown by the name of Jimmy Lyons. And Jimmy Lyons had the great ability that no matter what he touched, it turned to money, you see. He built the Lyons Theater over on the park, and that was a turn to money. And then Morristown had no hotel. And so he was able to get this piece of property between this property and the church. And if you step out there now, you're going to see it's a very narrow piece of property, but went almost all the way through here. And so to build a hotel in that little narrow place, he didn't have much room for the road, and that's why that's a narrow road. That property was built, that hotel was built, and was called a California Hotel. Everybody in Morristown, they couldn't imagine what a California hotel was. And so when it was built, the story goes that you paid $25 deposit when you went in there. You could stay for an hour, a day, or a week, or longer, and so forth. And everything that you needed to keep house was somewheres in the wall, including your bed. And if you touched the button, why, the bed came down, and that's where you slept. And you pushed the bed up, and you'd bring down a folding table. And there was 4 knives and 4 forks and a pot to boil water in and so forth. But that's the start of this place across the street. And that didn't last too long, and then they converted it to a hotel. And many of the people have said to me, how come they built a hotel with no lobby? Well, it was never going to be a hotel. It was just going to be a California apartment house. So that interests me. I take you across the street over here where Walkwell Shoe is. That was the plumbing store. And they always had the display of all their fixtures and so forth. And I always was interested. They didn't have any chairs, and people just used to sit on the fixtures that were there, you see. And you didn't think anything about it. As you walked on up past the Redeemer Church, I go back when I do remember the wooden church. I don't want you people to think I'm an old man, and I have to be very careful what I say. But I do remember the wooden church, and I remember when Kate Fox played the organ there. And if you went past the church, why, there would be the National Iron Bank, and Mr. R.D. Foote on a busy weekday morning would be out there with his very, very lovely suit of clothes, perhaps striped pants and a fancy coat, and around his neck was a black ribbon, and on it were his spectacles. And he would be out there, and he'd corner anybody that would walk by, hoping that they'd come in and borrow $1,000 from the bank. He was looking for business. For the benefit of you people that don't know this, if you go down James Street today and see the Loyola House of Retreat, well, that was R.D. Foote's home. And many as a fancy affair we served there. And all of Springbrook Country Club was his backyard. And that later became the Springbrook Country Club. We walk on up past the bank, and there was Morrison Somerset. That was the electric company. And next to that was the Masonic Hall and the big rooms. They later became Shecker John's furniture store. On the corner was Henry Smith's drugstore. And I used to sneak across the street. Every bit of ice cream that was served at their soda fountain came from Days. And I'd sneak across the street hoping no one would see me, and I'd go over there and sit at the fountain. We didn't have a soda machine. We just had the ice cream. And I'd sneak in there, and I'd pay 20 cents for a glass of ice cream soda that I could have gotten the ice cream free back on the other side of the street. Walk around the corner, and there was Finkelstein's Delicatessen. That was a unique place. You walked up 3 or 4 steps to get to it because it was a converted home. And that was a real old-fashioned delicatessen. People used to always say to me, I would go out in mixed company, and they'd say, "My, you smell just like a bake shop, but you smell good," you see. When you couldn't walk by Finkelstein's Delicatessen, the people wouldn't know that you'd walked by there. You never tasted and smelled so many pickles and so forth and so on. As you went on down, why, there was the parsonage, you know. Different religions have different names for their places where their pastors live. Well, the Methodists always had a parsonage. And there was the Methodist church, and I remember before the record building was built, there were 2 beautiful old homes there, the Schofield property and so forth. Then if we go around the corner, some of you are Presbyterians. Have you ever noticed that in the great round room at the end of the Presbyterian church, there's some pictures of that church being built? Look at it sometime and realize that these buildings that were built here in Morristown were built without machinery. And they have pictures of the ramps that were built around the round end of that church, where the laborers would wheel the material up these ramps to the scaffolding to build that church. Well, next to that was Jimmy Lyons Theater. That was built just about when I came along, and it was the theater in Morristown. The building was built with 2 figurines with their backs bent over like this, and the beam that went across the theater was held up theoretically by these 2 mannequins that were holding this great beam that went across the stage, across the auditorium. Next to that was the Becker block, and that was like an apartment house, and Oliver and Drake had their plumbing store, and Ike Jolly had his electrical store there. I was standing in front of our place one Christmas, and it was a cold night, and all of a sudden I looked across the park, and flames started to shoot out of the Becker block. Well, Ike Jolly and Ed Jolly, they had a display of electric trains, and they were making it to look like winter, and they'd taken cotton and had laid it down in their store window, and the electric train set the cotton on fire, and there was hell to pay after that. On the corner, going down Town Hill, as we used to call it, was police headquarters and the fire department. Across the street was the McAlpin block. And the McAlpin block was kind of interesting to me because the building that my grandfather bought when he first came to Morristown was the original Washington Hall. And when the McAlpin block was built, and this is the McAlpin family, McAlpin Hotel and so forth, there were many McAlpin families in Morristown, they had a hall over there, and it was up on this second floor, and absolutely no elevators, no nothing, and we were the caterers. And all our ice cream and all the food, everything had to be carried up these steps, the same steps that the guests came up. And in those days, we didn't have styrofoam. We had great heavy tubs of ice and salt to carry the ice cream up. Next to, in the basement of the McAlpin block was S.B. Carson's. And that was the most wonderful dry goods stores, blankets and all kinds of fancy linens and so forth. You people that, if I were talking to some really young kids, you know, they would know what I was talking about when I told them S.B. Carson had trolleys that they used to call, and all the money was handled on a trolley. And you went into S.B. Carson's and you made your purchase, and you gave your money to the girl. She would put it into a little round mahogany cup, and she'd screw it into a thing and pull a chain, and it would shoot up to the cashier that was down the other end of the store. It came back by gravity, you see. And S.B. Carson, he lived over here on Franklin Street. There's a great many stories about S.B., but we'll not go into those. Next to that was the U.S. Hotel. And I can remember when it looked as though the porch across the front of the hotel, it was built on the style of some of the hotels up in Sarasota. Saratoga. But it had these great columns. And all the town characters used to sit along there and chat and so forth. It didn't get swept very often. I can remember what a filthy, filthy place it was. Underneath was John Atz's barber shop. That's where I got my haircut. And I'd sit there and wait until Joe Rometta would cut my hair, because I wouldn't let anybody else cut my hair but Joe Rometta. And then we'd go along, and of course there was a very, very famous Boniface's Market. Perhaps some of you read some of the articles that my brother has written about these wonderful, wonderful stores in Morristown that cater to Morristown society. And it was simply remarkable when you made your trip around the park to see the quality of the stores that were there, that had the necessary supplies to cater to the wealthy, wealthy millionaires of Morristown. I've spoken down at Fairleigh Dickinson recently, and I was so amazed that these young students, they came right out and they said, "Mr. Day, didn't you resent waiting on these millionaires?" I said, "Resent it?" I said, "They were our bread and butter." I said, "We would do anything to them. We'd get down on our knees to cater to them and do the best we can." And if you were a wealthy lady in Morristown and you were having guests for dinner, remember, there was no of these modern conveniences that you know about. You would call up Boniface's Market, and if you were having your dinner at 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock, whatever it was, they would deliver to your back door the opened oysters on the half shell or clams on the half shell that you transferred from trays of ice onto your dishes and served them. You couldn't get them ahead of time. They were delivered when you wanted them. Phillips Hardware Store was a great place there. It had all kinds of old-fashioned things. Go along, and there was Parker and Van Cleves. Parker happened to be a friend of mine, a relation of mine. This young lady here who knows could tell you more about that. But to walk into that store and see this great long store, as I remember, nothing in it but silverware and glasses. It wasn't a department store. It was a jewelry store and silver and so forth. On the corner was the Babbitt Building. That was a 4-story building with an elevator, the only one in Morristown. When I was a kid, I never knew of a place in Morristown that had an elevator except the Babbitt Building. And Dr. Crane was my dentist, and he was up on the 3rd floor. And it was an open shaft with just metal cages around it, and the car was an open thing, and you kind of worked this handle, and the thing went up and down. Dr. Crane, later on, I'll just tell you a cute little story about Dr. Crane. He built a place right over here on DeHart Street, and it was the last word. It was a private building, and he had 2 operating rooms and a waiting room and a little lab in the back. And it was a little show place. And Dr. Crane's trade was all the very, very wealthy people in Morristown. However he got there, I don't know, but he was also my dentist. But anyway, I used to hear Dr. Crane tell the story. When you went into Dr. Crane's office, they always had Esquire magazine. And very, very few people in Morristown could afford Esquire. And Dr. Crane used to tell the story that the daughter of one of our very, very lovely, wealthy families was waiting for her turn to come into the operating room, and Dr. Crane looked out and saw that the girl had Esquire magazine. And without thinking, he spoke very quickly. Oh, he says, "You shouldn't be reading that magazine." She says, "I'm not reading it." She says, "I'm just looking at the pictures." So, as we crossed Washington Street, I can remember when Washington Street was a brick-paved hill, and because we had heavy winters with no snowplows, we had ruts. And there were just about 3 or 4 tracks that you could get into with your car. And if you got into those cars, you went to the end of the street before you could turn around. In the spring, why they would bring men out with picks to try to break it down so you could turn out. But once you got in those ruts, why you stayed there. And as the snow and ice started to melt, why the water would just run down those ruts, and they would keep them real steep until you got ready to turn out. Talking about the changes, on the corner of Bank Street is the Bell Building. It's still there. George Mintz has his big sign there. But that was the Woolworth store. And I can remember, and perhaps some of you also can remember this, but think now if you were just 20 years old, and I told you that you walked into that store, and immediately over your head was a red and gold sign that said, "Nothing in this store over 10 cents. And it's amazing. I just happened to be walking by Woolworths this afternoon waiting to come in here, and I see that their special today is an egg salad sandwich for $1.75. That was more than we charge for our Sunday dinner, which you've heard me tell about. You got everything from your oysters on the half shell all the way down through very many courses, and that was $1.25. But an egg salad sandwich at Woolworths this afternoon is $1.75. Going back just a little bit, if you'd gone up Speedwell Avenue, on the left-hand side, you would have seen a little small store that was called the Fair. And this was run by a family by the name of Epstein. And Mr. Epstein and Mrs. Epstein were the most gracious people you could imagine. You went in there and you knew you were going to be satisfied, and if you got something that wasn't right or you didn't like, all you did was take it back, and there was no question whatsoever. And that was called the Fair. And of course, you know the development. They finally moved over, and we lived next door to Mr. and Mrs. Epstein. They were very, very dear friends of ours. And they tell that it was always a great question in their mind whether they should have left Speedwell Avenue to come over on the park. Well, they did very well. Well, they did come over on the park and so forth. But coming down next to the Bell Building was the Morristown Trust Company. I wish you people could, some of you remember, to go into that place. It was the most conservative, old-fashioned place in your life. Everything was a very light golden oak furniture, all the counters and so forth. And the cages above the counters were all black iron and fancy grill work and so forth. And all the tellers were always in back of these cages and so forth. Well, on the corner there of Market Street was George Milik's shoe store, and that was quite a place. And then beyond the shoe store was the Greeks. And there was the Greek candy store, and they also had, next they had two stores. They were both the same. Some of you have seen old pictures of Morristown. You'll see these round signs up over these two stores. One of them was a candy store, and again, I used to sneak up there, and I could get a cherry smash. It was just the brightest colored flavored liquid with a little carbonated gas in it. But there again, I used to sneak up there. Here I came from WF Days, where I could have anything. I'd sneak up there to get a glass of that cherry smash. And then my cousin, by marriage, had the store next to that. That was D.P. McClellan's. And then, of course, came WF Days. And I don't think anybody doesn't know about WF Days here? I don't believe so. But that was quite an institution also. So when you think that the type of stores, I missed one fancy store in Morristown. In fact, I missed two of them. Let's continue on down past WF Days and think of Acker, Maryland, Connet. Acker, Maryland, Connet was a store that could not exist in Morristown today. There'd be no reason for it to. But you could go in there and buy the finest imported cookies, Huntley Palmers, all the most beautiful boxes. You could buy the most fanciest, all kinds of wine jellies. You could buy the very, very finest of imported coffees. You could buy great big red bananas, the biggest oranges, the biggest apples, everything that catered to Morristown society. And they had these black shelves with all turned spindles that held the shelves up. And what was on the top shelf, why they had to take one of the hooks, and grab it and bring it down and lay it down. The odor, my brother talks about the odors of Morristown. The odor of Acker, Maryland, Connet would make the person who had been eating all day long, you walk into Acker, Maryland, Connet, you immediately became hungry all over again. Next to there was Rutan's, the finest meat store you could possibly get. And they also had some fresh delivered in a white truck. My brother tells the story that when they first had the automobile shows around Morristown, the truck that delivered Rutan's meats always won first prize because it was always freshly painted with the most beautiful gold scroll work around it in red letters, Rutan Brothers and so forth. Up on Washington Street was another store that catered to Morristown society. If you had lots and lots of money and you had a new horse, or if you had a new carriage, or if you were going to do some saddle riding, you would go to D.S. Brink's and you would have a saddle made to your specifications, size and likewise and so forth. And to go into that store, and we always told the story about Mrs. Brink. She was a very dear friend of my mother's. We always called her Stinky Brinky because her father and her husband worked in this harness store, and this odor of those saddles and so forth. Does that ring a bell with you, Stinky Brinky? Yeah, I thought it would. But anyway, sometime I have to get my brother up here and let him tell you about the smells of Morristown. There was a bake shop up on Washington Street by the name of Wise Bake Shop, and he used more mace than any other bake shop in the country. And you couldn't buy anything up there that wasn't flavored with mace. And that was another unique thing in Morristown. So here we have a center of Morristown. Oh yes, the trolleys went around Morristown. There were three kinds of trolleys. One was made with just 4 small wheels. It was just one truck, as we call it. And it just bounced up and down like this. And if you got into that, you could go to the state hospital. If you got into one of the green trolley cars, you could go to Maplewood. And then later on, if you got into one of the new, yellow, fast trolley cars, you could go to Newark. And the trolleys went one way, and then finally they got the traffic to go the other way, and that was quite an event to to have the trolleys come toward you, but you couldn't go that way. You had to go the other way around Morristown. What a time it was when the traffic in Morristown demanded that we have one-way traffic around the park. I would sit out in front of the store day after day, a week after week on a Sunday, and every car that came up South Street and didn't see the sign one way and would go the wrong way, we always said it came from Union County. In those days, every license had a letter on it, and we knew where they came from. Morris County, because we had Monmouth, Middlesex, and Mercer, and Morris, why we got stuck with the letter V. And so everybody that had Morristown had a car license. You got that from Jerry White, you remember? He was a fine fellow, too. But the Union County cars were always the ones that went the wrong way. So here we have this town with all these wonderful stores and the society people. Very shortly, you people are going to see in the Daily Record, and I don't know when it's coming out, it's going to be quite a display, but there's going to be an article in the Record titled, "By Their Dress You Will Know Them." And it's going to name all these characters that were in Morristown that you knew them by their dress. And my brother has written it, and he talks about Carrie Foster and M. Grace Smith, Mrs. Seth Thomas, who always came on Saturday morning in this most beautiful riding habit with a cutaway skirt because she rode side saddle. And Mrs. George Marshall Allen, she was the master of the house of where the general drafting is now, down in Convent. And she had a black ribbon, 1 inch wide, that went around her neck, and it was called a choker, with a most beautiful set of 3 pearls on the front of here. My brother went down to see her daughter very recently, who was Alice Foote McDougal, had the Alice Foote McDougal Tea Room in New York. And my brother had this tape, and he was playing the tape about Mrs. George Marshall Allen's choker, and Mrs., I forget her name, she's married, but anyway, she said, "Just a minute, Mr. Day," and she went in the closet, and she brought out this black ribbon with these pearls, and she said, "Do you know that my mother was petrified wearing that, but it was her style, she had to wear it." And she had a special clasp, and it's still right here in Morristown, and it shows it was a clasp that was made with a spring, so that if she for any reason choked, it would give. And that same pin is still in existence right here in Morristown. So these people that had these lovely homes, they all had to entertain. And it was the stores in Morristown that could cater to those people. They had not only the stores, but they had the old-fashioned domestics, the butlers and the chambermaids and so forth, the Irish that came here that had that type of job and so forth. And of course, it's been a wonderful experience for me to know Morristown when it was the wealthiest town per capita in the United States. It didn't last very long. But sometime I wish I could get a big bus and get local people that would like to go with me and drive around Morristown. So many of the people here today, they have no idea. They drive by something every day and they don't know what they're looking at. Just go with me down here by the Blair apartment houses on South Street, and McCurdy iron fence and pillars are still there. That was the McCurdy. And if you look up at this Morristown book, you'll see this beautiful, lovely tan brick building. And those same tan bricks are right down there on South Street today. And every house along Madison Avenue has its own story. When they tore down Mrs. Ridley Watts's house and Mellon's and Colonel Dolier's house to build a memorial hospital, the memories of those places. I was there in the fire department when Mellon's burned down, and we saw the flames licking up in the attic and the water damage to that lovely home. Mrs. Ridley Watts was her husband was a linen merchant on New York, and she had the most beautiful dining room. In her dining room, on the ceiling was this lovely, I don't know whether you'd call it a Haddon Hall ceiling, but there was this molded oval creche that was there. And underneath it, she had a oblong table, which was almost the same shape as this oblong medallion that was up on her ceiling. And all the time you walked into that dining room, the dining room table was always covered with a beautiful white cloth, and there were these two beautiful silver pheasants, one facing this way, one facing the other way, and their tails went around in back of each other's, so that the same oval shape of those two beautiful silver pheasants were on her dining room table. All of the homes, they all had something unique about them. Go with me down to 151 Madison Avenue, the Caseby House, and go into that place and see just try to picture what it was. I had the pleasure the other day to go down to Normandy Park, and we had a lovely dinner down there for the Speedwell Village people, and that was the old James Eddy House. And to see the woodwork, to see what it took to build that and to keep it up and so forth. Those of you who have been down to Fairleigh Dickinson and seen those mahogany doors and so forth, this is all a part of it. Every day, you people know, I go up to Mendham, and I cook breakfast for 100 kids up at a school, which in the home that was built in 1912. Now, that's not too long ago. But this home was built by Governor Murphy. And to see the quality of the building material, all the casement doors have a rounded edge, that the rounded edge goes into a convex and concave arrangement here. The fitting of them is all perfect. You go out in the kitchen and look into this little small narrow room. As you go in on the right are two tremendous big safes where they kept all their silver, and all these beautiful cabinets where they kept all their fine dishes and so forth. Every home had their own thing. Go down to Acorn Hall and go downstairs and look at that room at the bottom of the stairs. Go around, and on your left you'll see the chimney, and cut out of the chimney there is a hole. The chimney is very wide, and they're recessed into the chimney as the range that they used. And that range, think of the fancy dishes that were served in those homes for their entertaining, all cooked on that type of a range with coal. No thermostats, no nothing. I simply rave when I think of the quality of food that the people and the help that we had working for us, how they could produce that type of food with the equipment that they had. And I can remember so many of these homes down on Madison Avenue, all with their basement kitchens and their dumbwaiters and so forth. And but this was Morristown. We thought nothing of the foolish things. You've all heard me tell the story about delivering ice cream on Saturday for Sunday. You couldn't buy ice cream any other place if you wanted, and WFJ would continue to be a Methodist. You didn't get the ice cream delivered on Sunday. You had to have it delivered on Saturday. And we never thought anything about how ridiculous it was to go through all these gyrations to get your ice cream there, delivering it on Saturday afternoon so you could have it for Sunday. But that was what you did in those days. And I just enjoy, particularly talking to young people. I talked over the Morristown High School last year, and they just couldn't believe when I would tell them the story. My brother has done a tape, and we're going to get a copy of it and going to give it to the course that they give down at Fairleigh Dickinson. They're hoping to make a moving picture. Whether they're going to be able to get it done or not, I don't know. But if you ever get a chance, and it is done, it's going to give you the most wonderful opportunity. They're going to try to go up to Del Barton and these big homes that are still in existence, and they're going to try to get a movie together and picture what it was to have these homes when they were kept up to the absolute perfection as far as their grounds and their trees and their beautiful bluestone driveways that they would have men out with wooden rakes smoothing them over day after day, every day, just to keep them all perfect. But this was Morristown. it's interesting for me to compare the difference. I'm the baby of the family. I used to dread that fact, but I'm very proud of it now because I'm the youngest. And but my brother and my oldest sister, it's so interesting for me to see the difference that 12 or 14 years made. I don't remember the fire horses. I don't remember some of the unique things. I don't remember the fence around the park. I do remember roller skating around the park, but that 12 years makes a big difference. I can remember I was born and brought up on Avenue Avenue, and I can remember when Mrs. Kissel would come down with her tally-ho. And literally, I have a complete mental picture of this tally-ho coming down Mill Street, up Early Street, down Avenue Avenue, up Washington Street, into Morristown. And this was a tally-ho built like an old-fashioned Western stage with the seats up on top, and standing on the back were 2 footmen, each one with trumpets. Not the type of trumpet that's wound up this way. It was one that was stretched out this way. And every time they came to a corner, they would blow this trumpet and so forth. Morristown was a great place. I could ramble on and on. I would love to have, does someone have something they'd like to ask me? Yes?
I'd like to know what a tally-ho is.
A tally-ho, you can see one if you go up to the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. But it was think of you know what a Western stage is? Well, think of a large coach swung between the 2 wheels. So it was on straps, you see, but built something like a house with the 2 seats up on the top and then the enclosed part inside. But it was simply a very fancy carriage to take people. It was you wanted to tie it in with the country atmosphere. It wasn't what you would drive up to around Central Park in. It was the rural thing, and all in bright colors and so forth. And of course, the footmen were on the back were all dressed in red coats, and they always have 4 horses. And the driver was on a seat outside of the carriage, and there was glass windows and so forth. Speaking of a tally-ho, I wish you would see go with me now up to the Seeing Eye Dog. That was Kemmy's. And Mr. Kemmy's always had all his cars custom made. And Mr. Kemmy's was a very, very tall man, and he always wore tall hats. But when Mr. Kemmy's had a Lincoln or a Pierce Arrow, whatever it was, the car that he wanted, he always had a handmade custom body on it. And it was made so that he could sit in the back seat, and you could see his legs. The plate glass windows in the side were so high and so tall that you could see his full trunk and his high hat on top of that. And he'd sit in the back just so everybody knew that was Mr. Kemmy's. No other car anywhere, I don't think, was ever made to look like it, but that's where Mr. Kemmy's at. Who else has a question?
Did you speak about phonies which had been specimens and so on?
Well, I'll tell you a quick story about that. You would enjoy this. I went down to Florida, and I didn't tell you that up here on the corner of the Hart Street was Hips and Dairy. That was the dairy, the milk store. And so when I went down to Florida, Jack Hipson, who married one of the Whisk girls in Morristown, was down there. And I hadn't seen them for I don't know how long. They had no idea who I was. But I would have known them if I hadn't been known in advance that's where they lived. So I went up to this girl that was standing there, and I said, "You're a Whisk." And she looked at me. She couldn't imagine who I was. And she wanted to know right away. And I said, "No, I'm not going to tell you who I am till I see your husband." And Jack had just come home from the hospital. He wasn't feeling too well. But I walked in, and I said, "You know who I am?" And he didn't know. And so I started to hint. And the first thing I said, "Does the number 197 mean anything to you?" And that was in the days when you picked up the telephone, the operator said, "Number, please." And if you wanted Hips and Dairy, you said 197. And the more I spoke like that, he was just so he just couldn't, his thinking organs just all went to pieces. And that didn't mean anything to him. And so finally I said to him, what was the best ice cream you ever had in Morristown? And he says, Thoddy's. I said, I ought to slap you in the face. He says, you're Tom Day. He said, you're Tom Day. That was the thing that broke the ice. But, before Thoddy's, there was one of the interesting stories about that place was when it was Veets. And if you went down to Princeton, after they left this was just after World War I. There were 2 stores in Morristown that were practically put out of business because the owners were so pro-German. One was Lambert's, which was the store where the exclusive shop is now. And the other was Veets, which is what you speak of as Thoddy and Speckman's. But they were very, very pro-German, and they didn't have a good reputation in Morristown at all. But I can still see the beautiful big, I guess it was a Tiffany glass, colored stained glass light over their soda fountain and so forth. That was, who else has that? Yes?
Did you say you were in Ocean Grove and East Orange?
Not down East Orange. Very briefly, for those who are interested, my grandfather started in Morristown, and because he was a Methodist, every place there was a chance he could sell peanuts and ice cream, where he went. He went to Mount Tabor, which was the Methodist camp meeting, and then Ocean Grove, when they built the auditorium. And if you go down to the auditorium today and walk out the front door and turn to your left, you'll run right into Days, and the sign is still there. That store he started that. My grandfather designed the open garden, and the furniture is still there, and the tables are still there, and the old Fairbanks scale is still there. It's been sold so many times, I tell the story that it's like the Vermonter who claimed he had the same straight razor for 52 years. He had 3 new handles and 4 new blades. But he put his brother, my Uncle Pennington, in business there. And then later on, Pennington's daughter went over to the Ocean Grove, the Asbury Park store. That was Irving Reed, her husband. And then because the Ocean Grove and the Asbury Park store were successful, and because they had the skilled people that could make the ice cream and so forth, they had to keep them during the winter. And so they rented a place in Newark and started the store there. And that store was always called W.F. Day and Brother. But it was my grandfather's brother's family that was connected there.
You were never in East Orange?
Never in East Orange, no.
Someday.
Now, the only days in East Orange, the Newark store, we never went, the Morristown store never went into Essex County. It was never an agreement, but so many people that tell me they lived in the Oranges and said they served their wedding. I said, well, it was my uncle that served that, because all our business was in Morris County. We went up to Goshen and down to Princeton and so forth. But all the people that knew about Days, they had the same coffee cake, the same ice cream and so forth. Of course, different people were baking it. It was all individually owned and operated. But no, there was just Asbury Park, Ocean Grove, and Newark and Morristown. That was the only. So, well now, folks, one more.
You catered at all these beautiful weddings?
That's right. And I could go on and tell you the difference between a catered fair today and what they were. You came to those homes, you came there to eat. You didn't come there to get drunk. You came there to eat the most beautiful food. And as big as these homes were, it's interesting to note that we had to serve perhaps 200, 300 people in these homes. Yes, they were big, but we couldn't sit everybody down. So that every type of food that we served, particularly during the winter months when we couldn't have the marquee tents outside, all had to be something that was served on a plate that you could hold the plate in one hand and your fork in the other. And that's when we developed these things, our famous lobster chops and our chicken croquettes and creamed oysters and chicken a la king and all those type of things. It was all what you call today bite-sized food. Folks, I have a little tradition. I told you that I always speak at random. And just so that I won't break my tradition, I'd like to close by telling you and giving you a little presentation. I give this with my apologies to Carolyn Wells. And if you remember St. Nicholas Magazine and Carolyn Wells, well, she wrote a little monologue which was entitled The Overworked Elocutionist, and I think you'll enjoy it. The schooner Hesperus, the breaking waves dashed high. Why is the forum crowded? What made this stir in Rome? Under the spreading chestnut tree, there is no place like home. When freedom from her mountainside cries, twinkle little star, shoot if you must, as all gray-head King Henry of Navarre. Roll on the deep and dark blue castle of Dragonfell. My name is Narvel from the Grampian Hills. Ring out, you wild bells, and if you waken, call me early. To be or not to be. The curfew shall not ring tonight. Ah, woodman, spare that tree. Charge, Chester, charge, on, steadily on, and then it will be clever. The boys stood on the very deck, but I go on forever. Now, his elocution was superb, his voice, his gestures fine, and his schoolmates all applauded as he finished the last line. I see, thought Robert to himself, it makes no difference what I say, as long as I proclaim the story of Morristown.